Welcome to the Black Secret.
All right, greetings, everybody. Today at the Black Secret, we have a very special guest in the house. He promises to give us a Black history lesson in 6 images. So, can you introduce yourself, sir? Introduce your page and your social media handles to our audience.
Sure. Thank you, Robin. It's really a pleasure to be here. My name's Andrew. I run a channel called the Kings Monologue, which is I would say it's a Black history network, with the hope of being a Black history media outlet. When I say media outlet, hopefully, multi-platform in the future. But at the moment, we are focused or at least restricted to social media for our outlets. We have a quite a thriving YouTube channel, which has got just shy of 80,000 followers. We've got a TikTok channel, which has about 20,000 followers. And then we're also on Instagram, but without the numbers to shout about. And we focus on basically revealing African history as much as possible. I like to tackle topics that are straightforward that people have heard of, but also more controversial topics that I feel, as you would know because you've written several books on them, are hidden from the general public. So people aren't aware of the rich and deep history that Black people have. Um, I'm always tempted whether or not to say African or not, but I have now begun to just settle on Black or melanated as opposed to African because I feel like, Black people are basal to every continent, and therefore it's a disservice to call it African history. It just in my case, not in anyone else's case, but in my case, it's a disservice to call it African history. It's African when it's African, but when it's not African and it's global Black history. So yeah, that's in a nutshell who I am and what I do.
So, how successful has your online experience been? I mean, I'm hearing some big numbers in terms of subscribers. Tell our audience how it's been.
Um, it's been quite surprising. The channel's not that old; it's about a year and a half old. So we grew really fast. I should say I grew really fast. And I wasn't expecting to. But I guess the timing was good because it was very much a culmination of several skills that I already had, and then my passion, which obviously is the same as your passion, which is Black and African history. And I think because I took an approach where I thought about what has an impact on me, and I realized that visuals actually have a really big impact. And I think as a community, and when I say community, I mean Black and African people, we um over the years have lacked the the infrastructure and the resources to compete with Europeans and Eurocentric history on that front. They were fronting the Reconstructions, and they were doing all the funding, and they were gatekeeping the mummies or the whatever it is. They had all the powerful the power and the funding to be able to commission, you know, artworks and reimaginings of what people look like. The books, the textbooks have, heavily illustrated that circulate around, basically the general public. So they were very much in charge. And obviously, film and media goes without saying. They, without fail, without every 2 to 3 years, will release a new propaganda piece. Conditioning people as to what ancient people look like. And that's not only in ancient Egypt, that's everywhere, ancient Egypt, Greece, everywhere. They condition people that these people looked and spoke a certain way. So they've always had a monopoly in that area. And I think my approach was to utilize the tools that are available to us now in 2023, 2024, that allow us to create our own visuals, which I think are much more credible. Therefore, they're much easier to create our own visuals that we can then put in front of people. And I think that resonates resonated. And that's one of the reasons why I think it grew quite fast. So it's been successful. I want it to be bigger. You know, I want the channel to be bigger, not just for my own ego, but I want to reach more people. But I'm happy that we've had a few, successes in terms of some of the, bits and pieces of content that we've created going viral and reaching lots and lots of people. And I know for a fact that we've pricked the ears of the industry and the establishment, who are being very responsive at the moment to anything that we put out. So yeah.
Thank you very much. Okay, so to the general audience out here, the King's Monologue is just about to give us a Black history lesson like no other. So, sir, can you get your slides on the ready? And while my man is getting his slides on the ready, I'll prepare for a Black history lesson where essentially we're going to discuss 6 images and then use that as a basis for a deeper discussion into Black history, global Black history. Okay, are you ready, sir?
Yeah, I am ready. Let me figure out how to share.
Okay, well, the first and obvious questions is what is this? What date is it? Where's it from? And you go ahead, you roll.
Yeah, so the presentation that I'm going to give you today is actually one that's quite timely because I just released a video yesterday on this very subject. So it's a bit of a case study in that I think normally the approach, I guess, is to look at things from a macro perspective and gather various pieces of artwork and say, or pieces of anthropological data, and then used as a basis for discussing and debating the Africanity of ancient Egypt. And by the way, obviously the focus of today is going to be ancient Egypt, and Tutankhamun is going to be the case study. But I thought the reason this one struck me as a really important angle to take was actually if we get rid of all the noise and we focus in on the individual, what I find is that the evidence for the Africanity of the individual is, it's pertinent. It's very, very strong, and it's almost impossible to argue against. And what that allows us to do is to say, okay, cool. Let's forget all the other stuff. This one individual that the world has so fixated on, how African was he? Which population do you think he would fall into based on the evidence that you're going to be presented with? So I'm going to just present some of the evidence that I've presented in the latest presentation that I've done. And feel free, or by the way, to jump in and ask questions or interrupt me at any point, because I probably prefer actually communicating that way. But it's a focus in on Tutankhamun. So, like you said, this statue that you see in front of you, this piece of artwork you see in front of you, is being called his sentinel guards, or one of his sentinel guards. There were actually a pair of them, and they were found at the door of his tomb, allegedly. I say allegedly because they like to do a lot of explanation. And there's 2 of them, and they're both jet black, these sentinel guards. So they're both jet black in color. And the Egyptologists will argue that they're jet black in color because they're Osirian statues, and they're done in the likenesses of Osiris. And Osiris was obviously the black god whose skin was dark, in reflection of the fertility of the Nile. That's the argument, the kind of like by the book argument they'll give you. The problem with that is that neither of the statues that they call Osirian are in the Osirian pose. He doesn't wear the Osirian crown, which is a very specific crown, and he's not in the seated Osirian pose, which you would expect from anyone that's doing the Osirian. So it's very difficult to make that argument. Now, does that mean that the blackness that you see represented is a representation of black skin? I would argue not necessarily so. Blackness has a multifaceted meaning in ancient Egypt. Um, and I've, done a bit of a study on how essentially blackness was a representation of divinity. And this was a trend that actually carried out of ancient Egypt and carried on into ancient Rome and ancient Greece, who would paint all of their gods, as you would know, in black. That was a habit that they picked up from the ancient Egyptians. So that, crossing of blackness with divinity, and obviously they call the land Kemet, which is the land of the blacks. I believe this was a proclamation of their kind of like divinity. It was almost like a statement of superiority to say we are the closest to God. Um, so there's arguments to and for, I mean, to and against, but the bottom line is we have two statues. One way he's wearing this crown, which is called the Kat. Another one where he's wearing another crown called the Nemes. And they're both pharaonic crowns, and he's in a pharaonic pose. So this is, for all intents and purposes, a very naturalistic statue. And you can pause it and you can discuss, but you have to have some kind of a argument as to why he's chosen to paint himself black if he wasn't. So that's the kind of first thing I'd say there about this statue in particular. So anyway, the presentation is called "How African Was Tutankhamun?" because I think that's a really good question to ask. No, maybe not how black was Tutankhamun or was Tutankhamun, but actually how African was he? Because actually African is more than just a phenotype. It's a culture. It's a language. It's a physical manifestation. And I could even go into detail just on this image alone. The cat crown, I think, is actually one of the most interesting crowns in ancient Kemet because it's one that requires an afro. And people miss that, we call this a bonnet in our day and age now, where they but the ancient Egyptians didn't call it, well, the ancient Egyptian rulers didn't call it a bonnet, they call it the cat. But it still requires you to have three-dimensional hair, which only, people of African descent have, that grows outwards and upwards. So this is just this is one of the many clues we have to the Africanity of Tutankhamun. This is already a clue that his hair is Afro hair. So what do you do from that? So I'm going to progress the slide now. Feel free, by the way, to stop me and ask me any questions if you want to kind of get further, if you want to dig in a bit further about something I've just said.
Yeah. Okay, so we know what it is. So it's in his burial, so we can assume it's almost contemporaneous with him.
Mhm.
Okay,
Yeah.
so what was your reasoning for selecting this image?
My reason for selecting this image is because it's a really good image of him and it's naturalistic.
Mhm.
And I think that the one of the most controversial things that is done in ancient Egypt is
Mhm.
the treatment of their naturalistic statues as being invalid for some bizarre reason.
Oh, I
And
see. So it's naturalistic, then it's represented as symbolic.
exactly like everything
Oh,
is, there's not in according to Egyptologists, I won't say every single one, but a majority of Egyptologists, the ancient Egyptians never produced an accurate portrait of anyone because
right.
they entirely ignore them. And this is what has motivated so much of my work, is that I started off creating reconstructions, but not of the mummies,
Hmm.
statues. Because if you want to get the likeness of a person, you say, have you got a photograph or have you got a, portrait? And that's always been good enough. That's certainly is good enough when it comes to ancient Greece or ancient Rome.
Hmm.
They'll find a unlabeled statue of Julius Caesar floating down a river somewhere.
Hmm.
They'll declare it's Julius Caesar, and then they'll make sure every single likeness of Julius Caesar matches that statue. That's the order of events when it comes to ancient Rome. But when it
Hmm.
comes to ancient Egypt, you'll have a young king like Tutankhamun who has 400, you know, portraits in their different different formats from papyruses to statues to Schwabtes to
Sorry,
wall
sorry, sorry.
reliefs.
I misheard that. Do you want to give that number again?
Yes, 400 representations of Tutankhamun. If you add up all of the
400
wall reliefs, yeah,
representations. Hmm.
yeah.
I think that's powerful.
And
Efficient.
all of them are consistent. This is the thing, they're all entirely consistent with one another. You
Mm-hmm.
can't pull up a portrait of Tutankhamun that
Mm-hmm.
doesn't look like Tutankhamun. And
Mm-hmm.
yet they'll tell you, oh, these were symbolic. All the pharaohs were just really vain people, and then these things had nothing to do with how they looked. Well,
Mm-hmm.
then my response is that why do they all look like the same person?
Mm-hmm.
Why is it so easy for me in my mind to approximate the face of this individual if he didn't look like these various portraits? Even the wall reliefs retain the shape of the nose and the lips, even though obviously, in wall reliefs they had the habit of drawing the eye from front position but placing it on the side, if that makes sense. That was the kind of the ancient Egyptian um work when it came to how they produce wall reliefs, but they were still very, very accurate when it came to things like someone's side profile. They would
Mm-hmm.
get the lip protrusion, the prognathism, the angle of the nose, everything
So
would match the statue.
you used a big word there, prognathism. What's
Yes.
prognathism?
So prognathism is to do with the protrusion of the jaw. So
Mm-hmm.
basically, the protrusion of the jaw beneath the nose is called prognathism or subnasal prognathism. So you've kind of got three positions that
Mm-hmm.
your jaw can take beneath the nose. It can be prognathic, where it protrudes forward. It can be orthognathic when it's essentially flat, or it can be retrognathic, where it recedes behind the nose. So the ancient Egyptians were overwhelmingly a prognathic society, and this is one of the
And why is that
several
significant?
well, this is one of the several similarities they have with modern Africans. So essentially, one of the things that will should come out as we go through this presentation is that we're going to realize that they are very consistent with modern African societies, modern Central African societies. I have to stress that because obviously people will start to say, well, do you mean North African? And I'll say, well, there are melanated people in North Africa, but so if I meant North African, I'll be talking about them. I won't be talking about the others. So these are melanated or continental Africans, and the ancient Egyptians tend to just cluster and be consistent with them across every vertical. So yeah, I'm glad you asked that question. So the prognathism is one of the traits that you'll find basically as ancient Egyptian mummies, whenever they found them and the statues, they're either orthognathic, or mildly prognathic, or very prognathic. That's kind of the range that you get with ancient Egyptians.
All right, now can I take a question from Danny or George, who might, if you're ready to throw a question in, throw a question in. If not, then just tell me to move on, and then we can move on.
Thank you. I have no questions at the moment. I'm just enthralled by what King's Monologue is sharing. So I'm good to move on. Thank you.
Yes, hi, King's Monologue.
Hi.
Yeah, fantastic so far. I'm just really enthused to see where exactly we're going to go with this. I presume you're going to be talking about the crowns as well and how they function as headpieces for sort of like typically African style hairstyles.
I haven't planned to, but I think it's good that we segued into the topic though. So I think when they come up, it will be a good opportunity for us to have the discussion about that, just like we did here, because I think that was probably a good segue that we actually went into that discussion there that was kind of led by Robin. So I will try to, now that you've mentioned that, I'll try to touch on that as and when we get something visually supporting it.
Okay.
Okay, now before you go to your next slide, can I just ask one general question before we keep it moving? And that is, what sparked your interest in Black history in the first place?
Oh, wow. So I have to cast my mind back many, many years now. I actually a friend. I've always been interested in Black history. I think I've always been very much um interested in Black culture as a Black person, obviously, and being I've always been very proudly Black. It's just a way the way that I was brought up, raised, and what resonated with me. But I wasn't aware so much of Black history because obviously, if we grow up in the um, traditional sense, like a lot of people do in the diaspora, once again, this is something that's hidden. It's something that someone has to, at one point in your life, reveal to you and go, "Hey, did you know that XYZ were Black? Did you know that, Black people were in, and your jaw drops because you're like, I had no idea." So I do remember, um, Egypt was very much my doorway into studying Black history. And a friend of mine, just basically said the ancient Egyptians were Black, which I kind of had a lingering suspicion of from videos like Michael Jackson's Remember the Time. And, you had that lingering
Classic,
suspicion that
classic.
classic, brilliant video. So you have that lingering suspicion, but without the data to support it and without anything else, because obviously outside of Black people creating their own entertainment, and I think that goes on to the point that we were speaking about the originally of the importance of visualization. How powerful was that video for Black people globally? Without any lessons or anything coming with it, just to see that visualization made so much sense. We're like, hey, those are Africans. That's how Africans dress. Yeah, no one else dresses like that. It was so important to see that because we've been sold this visualization of, other people, dressing in Egyptian garb, which it doesn't look right because your people don't walk around chestless in the desert. That's not, shirtless in the desert. You don't do that. You can't do that, not for a sustainable amount of time anyway.
No, powerful point, sir.
Garb
Okay,
would
you want
say, outside of it being called ancient Egyptian garb, that's tribal wear.
to?
Someone walking around barefoot with nothing but a white loincloth on, which was the uniform, is essentially someone who looks very tribal. That's something you will see in Africa. It's tribal wear. So yeah, just having those visualizations was really important. So someone came to me when I would say this is, if I put a date on it, it's probably over 20 years ago now, and kind of told me about the ancient Egyptians being Black, and I just wanted to know more. So they pointed me in the direction of Sheikh Anta Diop, which was my first purchase. I'm glad to say. And my second purchase was Destruction of Black Civilization by Chancellor Williams. And then I think within a year, I'd probably bought about 30 or 40 books. And I was just consuming our history. And then I think I did spend a little bit of time being a bit of I was a bit out there, a bit of an activist on Facebook. I started a group actually on Facebook that grew quite well actually. It grew to 70,000 members. And then Facebook closed it. And then we grew it again to and I think it's got like about 40 to 50,000 members now. I can't say the name of the group because then people will be able to track me. I don't like that. So, but I'll tell you later. But yeah, so I started that group. And then I think I took a period out where I was very quiet. And then I came back with the King's Monologue just like a year and a half ago. So it's just kind of a passion that I've kind of picked up and put down and picked up, but always known it for myself. And I guess this is it's nice to be out there again, presenting the information and telling people, about our history, or about African history, I should say. Yeah. This page is a bit of a summary of the focus of the presentation. Um, we're only going to cover the first 3 bullet points, so you have to forgive me, but I think there'll be enough data in those for us to have a good conversation anyway. And I guess my first question, and I'll make it a rhetorical one, you don't have to answer it. My first question is, this image over here, why isn't this image, i.e. this is Tutankhamun, by the way, represented as Amun. This is, or Amun, I should say. I always call him Tutankhamun and not Tutankhamun because Amen is the more African pronunciation I find. Amen, Amin, these are all Aman, these are all African pronunciations that you'll find across the Nile and across the Sahel. We actually preserve Amen quite a lot across both Bantu ethnicities and even across the Niger Congo and even in the Horn of Africa. It's quite a preserved name, which has augmented, but it's almost kept its roots quite well. But this is Tutankhamun represented as Amun, and this is as accurate as I could be a one-to-one representation of the statue. This statue is in the Louvre. And why isn't this like supremely accurate portrait taken into consideration when they create, reconstructions of the young king? That in itself, in my view, is a travesty, and that's deliberate. Like I said, Tutankhamun's portraits, of which there are hundreds, are incredibly consistent. He's one of the most portrayed individuals in history, both ancient, medieval, and modern era. And yet there's this whole idea, Zahi Hawass has this thing where every time he does a new reconstruction, he says, we can finally see what the face of Tutankhamun looked like. I'm like, we didn't need your reconstruction to do that, sir. With due respect. We have, you're literally looking at his mannequin and telling people he didn't look like that. So in the focus of this presentation will be a complete anthropological examination of Tutankhamun with the goal of estimating the most likely ethnic match based on the data, because there is a lot of data that Tutankhamun has left us with. This should inform the phenotypic choices of the reconstruction. Now, there's a reason why that's important as well, because, and I raised this when I did my paper critiquing the Amenhotep III reconstruction by Cesare Moraes. So that's a well-known reconstruction artist who's done another god-awful one that I feel I need to do a response to again. But he did a reconstruction of Amenhotep III and essentially made him look like a fat Western man. And I'm not saying that to be rude. That's literally what he made him look like, a fat Western man with a crown and and he just looked absolutely ridiculous. And the reconstruction process, a lot of people don't realize, when it comes to forensic facial reconstruction, the very advent of that process is to establish the ethnicity. That must be done. Doesn't matter which process you're using. So you could use the Manchester method, which is the one that Carolyn Wilkinson uses, which you've probably seen when they get the skull and they stick the pins all over it? Have you seen that reconstructions?
I haven't seen that, but okay. Explain it to us.
I'll explain it. So they get a skull and they stick pins all over it, all at the key points around the skull. And the pins are there because those pins are kind of locus points so that they can apply tissue to a certain depth. But the depth of the tissue they apply at that pin point will depend on the ethnicity that they've chosen. So they can't proceed with the reconstruction until they've chosen the ethnicity. Obviously, black people, for instance, you put a pin on a black person's teeth, top lip, I'd imagine for black people is going to be a much larger tissue depth than your average white person. That's just the way it goes. Then you have the Russian method, which kind of layers the muscles down first of all. So you've probably seen that one. A lot of them use that one in the clay where they lay the muscles and then they put the skin after they've placed the muscles. Once again, the depth of the tissue and the depth of the muscles is dependent on the ethnicity. And then you have Cesare Moraes, whose technique is very questionable, I'm going to say. And I've raised lots and loads of critiques about his approach because he does a lot of skull augmenting. He changes the shape of the skull, which is a topic we are going to come into today. Not him in particular, but how Egyptology doesn't like the skulls of the Egyptians because they're too African. So they do everything they can to de-Africanize the shape of the African skull. And he's guilty of that. But then once again, he'll apply his tissue based on, it's a digital method basically. So he does it all inside a computer. And once again, it'll be based on averages. So he's got maybe this database of 1,000 different faces of, living people, and then he'll create an average depth at each point, giving him a face to work with. All of these approaches rely on the ethnicity needing to be established at the first juncture. And that's why it's really important that when we do a reconstruction, this is what they should be doing. They should be doing, okay, based on the anthropological data, can I come up with a good and a sound and a reliable estimation as to what the ethnicity of this person is? Otherwise, my reconstruction is going to be incorrect. Ultimately, you can slap tissue data from any ethnicity onto a skull and come up with a completely different face. And they know that, they're aware of this, but they're happy to ignore that and then present to the world and go, hey, look at my fantastic reconstruction. And it was completely objective because we just, but they won't inform the public that they've chosen the wrong ethnicity from the start. So they were never going to come out or approximate anything that looks like the statues, and B, anything that came out looking like a African or a black person, because they never choose black as their default. So
right.
in this way, sorry, go on.
Yeah, so what you just said there is very, very powerful. But can I ask my two colleagues, do they have any questions on what the King's Monologue has said so far? I stress the word questions, not comments.
I suppose a question could be, based on what you've just said, just how significant is the tissue data in that sense? Because you've presented it as being absolutely critical. If the skull shape is so profoundly, I don't think I can say the word, oblong shaped, typical typical African characteristics. Some people like to say alien looking, but no, it's just typically African.
We call it a beanhead, don't we, in our community?
Yes, beanhead, or in Ghana we call it tico. That's the technical term there. Even if they put, say, a white sort of like tissue depth, would that still produce an African-looking type of person?
Not if they don't want it to. That's a very good question, by the way. It's a very good question. Not if they don't want it to. And this is the big issue. So for instance, with someone like Cesare Moraes, he really hates dolichocephalic skulls, the long-headed skulls. He hates them, so he just changes them. Yeah, I've challenged him about this a lot. So he'll move the position of the spine back 2 or 3 inches to make it look like the back of the head is shorter. He'll make the head slightly taller, flatten it a little bit. It won't even be a match. And I've challenged him about this on multiple occasions. He completely changed the shape of King Tutankhamun's skull, and he totally ignored me. And he just carries on doing what he does because he's got to get the funding, and he's already got the backing of Egyptology, and they don't care because they're not out to produce truth. Or in other cases, what they do most of the time. So if you was to take, once again, we're using Tutankhamun as a case study. If you was to take the Elizabeth Dana's reconstruction, which is the really famous one that everyone's probably familiar with, if you type into Tutankhamun, it's the first one that'll come up. She acknowledged the skull, but what she did is she just created a person that doesn't exist, which is what they do a lot of the time. So she's created this person with an African skull and European features, but you can't find that person in any living population. They're quite happy to create new. That's why they come up saying things like aliens, because they're creating these hybrid beings which have African skulls and European features that don't exist. And they don't just do it in ancient Egypt. They do it with all of the, all of the caveman reconstructions as well. They're digging up and they're finding really African skulls with really African features. And then they slap white tissue data and white features on them. Like, look at Cheddar Man. That's a perfect example, isn't it?
Yeah.
If you look at Cheddar Man, you've got someone with black skin who clearly should be a black person. By the way, he's supposed to have curly hair as well. And they totally missed out and just gave him straight hair. That was genetically, he was supposed to have curly hair. But let's ignore that. they get and then they put, you know, these white features on him, and they've created this basically white person with black skin, but that person doesn't exist. Why would you create a person that doesn't exist when the skull of Cheddar Man has, you know, has representation in Africa? His
Yeah.
exact skull, you can find that amongst African people. They would prefer to create something that is totally fabricated and then say this is what this person looked like, and it's ridiculous.
Yes, yes. Thank you for that. I could go on, but I won't. Thank you for that.
So could I. Say, very interesting conversation. So yeah, like I said, we'll cover artwork, craniometric, anthropometric, and we'll stop there, because I think we'll have gone quite long at that point anyway. The question, once again, another rhetorical question is this controversial? This is my reconstruction of King Tutankhamun. Now, I've done multiple reconstructions of Tutankhamun. I'm not ashamed to say, probably over a dozen, and I continually revisit him when I feel like I've got, you know, this part on that aspect wrong. But this is probably my latest. So you can see him here without a crown, looking slightly young, kind of based on the head of Nefertiti, which we'll talk about shortly. And then we have him here with that kind of Amen crown, like he's wearing in the mannequin image. And for the work that I do, these are really kind of like, I feel, our best approximations so far. These are my best approximations. I'm quite proud of these. I'm proud of the fact that I feel like I've been as true to his representations as possible. No need to exaggerate the features, no need to change them. And I feel like you could overlay any one of these representations, these images, these portraits of King Tutankhamun and say, yeah, that's the same person. That's my goal. It's not to make him black or to make him this and making that. It's to say, look, this is what he looked like. And does that representation, is it fair to say that this person looks like this person? Is it fair to say that? You can see my mouse pointing, right, can't you? Okay, good. It's just making sure. Sometimes I'm talking to people that don't know what I'm talking about. Yeah. So is it fair to say that this person with a hat on looks like this person? Is it fair to say that this person looks like this person with slightly longer hair? And I would say, maybe with my blinkers on, but I would say, yes, I think they all look like the same person. I think this representation really rings true for all of the different imagery that we're seeing around here. So if you have a look, just to go through this artwork really quickly, you have his Shwabtis, and actually there's a whole controversy around his Shwabtis, because I found that a majority of his Shwabtis have unfortunately been tampered. They've been quote unquote cleaned. And this is a really sad state of affairs. Even this one has been cleaned. The original color of a majority of his Shwabtis is like this one. They're varnished and they're shiny, a majority of them, and they're all consistent in this very deep medium brown tone. Well, I'll say medium to dark brown tone with a red undertone. That's the color that was on pretty much all of his Ushabtis. So we have a couple that have been preserved, but a majority of them, even this one, has been cleaned. So even though this one's still brown and for all intents and purposes to me still looks like an African, it's been cleaned. And you've got some that have been cleaned where now they're literally the color of pale wood. And then what they'll do on top of that is they'll re-enhance the eyeliner and they'll put red lipstick on. I mean, they do the most ridiculous things and they assume that people don't notice. And actually, for the most part, people do notice, but they don't care. And this is the unfortunate thing, like the tampering of Kemetic artworks is widespread, it's rife, and it's accepted. And this is the problem, it's entirely accepted. So, you know, we are very fortunate to have preserved pieces. One of my favorite pieces is the mannequin that you see up here, which to me, my mind boggles when people look at the mannequin of Tutankhamun and yet still want to debate whether or not this was an African boy. You know, and it's I didn't look very dissimilar to that at that age. I'm going to be totally honest with you, you know, and I think most of you would say the same. This is just the most typical African boy that you'd probably ever come across. From complexion to the, you know, the size of the cheek, everything is just very normal to us as Africans. This is one of his golden masks or cartonages, I should say. He has three of them. Oftentimes we only see the one golden mask, which is the one down here that everyone's familiar with. That's the kind of the golden, when they say his golden mask, this is the golden mask down here. But there's actually three, and they were kind of like Russian dolls where they opened one and there was another one inside, and they opened another one was inside. So this is his, I think this was his second cartonnage over here. All three of them look like the same person. Once again, you would have heard the rumor going around. People will tell you, oh, his golden mask isn't even him. It had someone else's name on the inside. Well, it looked like him. Once again, if that's so, I'd like to know who that someone else is because I haven't found them. I'm familiar with most New Kingdom artwork, and I don't know anyone else who has this face other than King Tutankhamun. So it's a very difficult, you know, you can make the argument based on some kind of hypothetical, but then you have to then argue against the fact that he has complete consistency with his artwork. I would actually ask you, do you feel, and this is a genuine question, kind of like out to you guys, if you're willing to answer, do you feel that this artwork is representative of the same person? Does it look as consistent to you that as it does to me? Or are there any that kind of raise a question mark for you?
Can I say,
Yep.
your stuff for me, and if you don't mind me coming on camera here, your stuff for me is the most realistic. My perspective is that, as you said before, there is so much sort of like between the range of statues, imagery, there's so much consistency. And my personal feeling is your stuff is the best of the reconstructions. I tend to feel that the original craftsmen who actually produced this portraiture were of the highest caliber. That's my take and my stance. I don't buy this idea that, you know, oh, you know, it's just generic and they were trying to make them seem more attractive. It's an attractive young black boy because he was an attractive young black boy. And I think your work really does do that justice. And of course, there's a lot of politics involved with this. I was talking to Robin on the way home from an event yesterday, and we touched on this a little bit because we're going to meet you today. And I looked at Robin at one point and said, these Egyptologists, they can't believe the nonsense that they're producing. Surely not. They surely can't even. I mean, look at the Middle Easternized version of Tutankhamun that you've got here. It doesn't make any sense at all. You know, these were some of the most gifted craftsmen of all time, and that's the truth of the matter. And I think it's important that people get an understanding of that. And I think that that's the work that we have to do to make people realize this is not generic. These guys were the most skilled craftspeople, and they were African.
Absolutely. Thank you. No, thank you very much for that input. And I think just to add to what you've just said there as well, I think we need to get more offended. I get offended, and I think we as a people need to get more offended when they make claims like this, because essentially it's that trope, isn't it, of, you know, we can't tell black people apart, so we can make up ludicrous claims that anyone who's kind of melanated upbringing will tell you, yeah, these look like the same person and these are consistent, and no, he doesn't look like this other statue that you're claiming. You know, he doesn't look like Ramesses. He doesn't look like, you know, Amenhotep III. He has his own face. And so we need to get more offended when they make these claims. You say, well, justify that, back that up. You can't just come up with any old, conclusion that you've just pulled, you've just literally pulled up because you're trying to. I mean, I've heard people say, and this is actually a common one. I'm sure Robin's heard this as well. They say the reason the lips are thick because their tools weren't sharp enough to. I mean, when you hear something like that, the mind boggles because it's first of all, they've created a carving, an accurate and smooth carving out of granite using technology that we're still not sure of because it certainly wasn't, those granite statues certainly weren't carved using iron tools, which is what they claim. So they clearly have methods of creating accurate statues, and we know with intricate hairstyles, intricate features, and yet they just couldn't get the lips any thinner. I mean, it's insulting, to be quite frank. So I do get really, really, I do get irate sometimes when we go over the subject because some of the things they've gotten away with saying are really out of order. So let me go through some of the questions that I've put up here. So I've said, first of all, why is this? And when I say this, I mean this, my reconstruction. Why is this being deemed as controversial? Surely it should be the default. Surely everyone would say, well, it looks like, it matches color-wise, it matches feature-wise, everything about it looks consistent. So yeah, I'd say that's a good reconstruction. But why do we live in a world where this is controversial and this is acceptable? That should tell you everything you need to know about the level or the degree of bias that we're dealing with. This should not be acceptable. This should be incredibly controversial. It would not be acceptable to take the one statue of Julius Caesar, which I don't believe is him anyway, but let's just humor US centrics and say, take that one statue of Julius Caesar that they have, and then create, a black man with someone who looks like Jimon Hunsu, for instance. Yeah. If I came back with that and said this is what Julius Caesar looked like, there'll be outcry. And yet when they do the reverse, there's complete, it's accepted. It's almost, it goes into textbooks. It's the first page of Google and it goes into Wikipedia as the official portrait of Tutankhamun. Ignore, it's totally unacceptable. So I've asked, would this be questioned in reverse? And that was the scenario that I just gave. It absolutely would be questioned in reverse. If the roles are reversed, it would not be acceptable. So yeah, there needs to be massive, massive uproar when they create these kind of monstrosities and then try to place them in general public view. Are these depictions, and when I say depiction, I'm talking about his portraits, are they realistic? Now, to me, maybe I'm biased towards, but I haven't seen many gold and bronze statues that rival what come out of ancient Egypt. But certainly Tutankhamun's cartonages. These are some of the finest gold statues or metal statues you will find. I think the only ones that would be a good comparison would be the ones from Benin. There's very few that you'll find that have this level of accuracy and detail. They are clearly very realistic. It's not like they've produced someone who doesn't look anthropomorphically human. It's absolutely someone who could have existed, someone with these precise features, and they are all very good. Like George just said, the ancient Kemetic or the ancient Egyptian artists were literally the best. And actually the one pushback I'd give is that there was shoddy artwork that came out of, well, that you'll find in Egypt. And those are the fakes. So you will find shoddy artwork, but those are the fakes. Nefertiti being one of them. And I know that might sound controversial, but Nefertiti is definitely a fake. And the reason I'll argue that is not from a emotional standpoint. It's from the simple fact that it's a limestone bust that's covered in stucco. And that is just something that the amazing artists of ancient Kemet would never do. If they are making a limestone bust, that would be limestone from core to outside. There'll be no layer of stucco because I'm an artist who I don't know how to work with the medium that I've been given. It's unheard of. So for that one argument alone, it absolutely is a fake. So yeah, ancient Egyptian portraiture is the best or among the best that we have in history. And actually, it would be really nice to see a renaissance of appreciating ancient Egyptian artwork because they've done a really good job of making people deride it and make, say, derogatory things about it. When does black mean black? This is an important question because I think one of the things that you guys have probably confronted, and I actually think this is something that we in the community have been guilty of ourselves as well, is looking for the black statue. Like I showed on slide one, the black statue. But there's black, but then there's realistic African. If I'm just looking at our call at the moment, Robin's skin tone is not very different from my reconstruction here. This one has a slightly redder undertone, which is something actually that's very regional. You see that amongst the Nubians. Nubians have a very red undertone. But these are realistic skin colors. And I don't think enough people respect the ancient Egyptian artists enough to respect that the Shwabtis, the Golden Throne portrait, the mannequin is absolutely a realistic portrayal of skin color. It wasn't symbolic. I think the Egyptologists have sold us this symbolic myth. Women are yellow, men are red. There were no red men in ancient Egypt, and there were no red men portrayed on the walls. Red was simply what has preserved after 3,000 years. The color was a reddish brown, and they would alternate the reddish brown with a deep dark brown when they had more than one ancient Egyptian person. So it's either a deep reddish brown or a deep dark chocolate brown. Those were the two colors that they would alternate for ancient Egyptians. You will never see an ancient Egyptian portrayed, or ancient Egyptian man portrayed in that kind of wheaty, woody color that you see modern Egyptians in. You will never see them portrayed in the color of, cream. Never in the entirety of his existence. You'll see that reddish brown and that deep chocolate brown. And the reason I raise that is because this is the color of black people. Okay. You do get black people that are much darker, and you do get black people that are lighter. But these are tones that are well within the phenotypic range of black people. And sometimes in the hunt for the black person, we miss the realistic black person, the actual black person. My skin is not black. My skin is brown. Robin's skin is brown. George, your skin is a lighter tone of brown. We are, I would say, all black people on this call. None of us have the same color. Why do we think that historically that kind of phenotypic variance didn't exist? Why we have whole populations of people in Northeast, East Africa, down the Nile, Great Lakes region, showing that that the entirety of African phenotypic variance. I would say in modern history, ancient history, there was never a time when every single black person was jet black. Was there probably a proliferation of more dark-skinned people? I would absolutely argue, yes, that would probably be the case. There probably was more black people, less penetration from the modern Eurasians, I will call them. But that variance that we have is still there and was still there. And I think that's what was being clearly portrayed in much of the ancient Egyptian artwork, a realistic portrayal of skin color. One argument I would just give to support that as well is the mannequin of King Tutankhamun. It's been decided and agreed by Egyptologists that this was what he would use to basically test clothes and outfits. So that's the reason it's life size. And if that's the reason that it's been given to the mannequin, which is this one up here, yeah, if that's the reason that it's been given, then on that basis alone, we have to believe that this was his skin complexion. We have to, because why? How is he going to see if something looks good on him? If he's using this essentially as a mirror to try on different clothes, why would he give it a spiritual, significantly, a spiritual color? He wouldn't. He'd give it as close to his natural skin tone as possible. So decisions could be made about what outfit he's going to wear. So yeah, that's just that question. Any thoughts actually regarding that? When does black mean black? I don't feel like I opened up something that maybe you want to ask something about.
Hi, yes. I think you're spot on. We do come in all kinds of like shades and colors. And I think one of the things that the Egyptologists have done quite successfully is to pigeonhole Black people, or like
Mm,
you're saying, to look for that um, um, undeniably sort of like characteristically Black face, which doesn't really exist. It's got to be profound, or what people will think as being profoundly Black. It's the old,
mhm.
what is it, True Negro hypothesis. There's
Yes,
only one Negro, it's the true Negro.
yes.
And it's a fallacy. It's a fallacy, you know. So yeah, absolutely, absolutely. But we're definitely with you on that one.
Brilliant. Yes. And I'm glad you mentioned that the true Nego trope. We talk about that quite a lot on the channel. Dr. Shamorka Keita talks about it quite extensively and really gives some very good insight into it. But one of the things that I actually did previously was we kind of focused in a bit on that entire true Nego trope. And what you'll find is the reason the true Nego trope exists, and this is it's very revealing once you actually come to that understanding, is that the true Negro is not a representation of the most common form of black. It's not a representation of um the most troublesome form of black or the black they don't like. It's simply the all of the features that are outside of the accessibility range of Eurasians for Eurasians to be able to claim them, or I should say, Caucasians to be able to claim them. So that is the only thing they're willing to give black, melanated, or African people, the thing that they absolutely can't claim. So when they come across, a face and it has a extremely broad nose outside of the range of Eurasians, and it has extremely thick lips outside of the range of Eurasians, and it has extremely dark skin outside of the range of Eurasians, they'll say, "Oh, well, there you go. That's black people. We can't claim this one. We'll give them that one."
Can I
That's the
jump,
true Negro. So,
can I jump in there?
yes, of course.
Yeah, just as long as it's not Gilgamesh in Sumer.
Yeah.
You've seen
All the
Gilgamesh.
Olmec heads. Yeah.
Yeah, that's when that argument then collapses. Yeah.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Yes, agree. They've still got their, question marks over it. But that essentially is the true Negro, the thing that they're going to find very, very difficult, not impossible, because nothing's impossible with them, as we can see, but the thing they're going to find very, very difficult to claim. So it's not a scientific thing. And this is the thing I explain to people, that you can go to, for instance, the Guinea region of Africa, okay? And you can find people with, very broad noses, very thick lips, okay? And dark skin. Then you'll go to Kenya and you'll find people who are very dark skinned, but they're also very tall and have very narrow noses and very thin lips, which is probably the dominant phenotype on Kenya. Which one of these is blacker than the other? Which one's been in Africa longer? Who's the true African? Both of those are true Africans. Both of those are true Negroes. But the difference is, when the Kenyan passes away or dies and he's done something great and they find his skull, they're gonna go, look at this fine Eurasian skull we found in Kenya. What did we build here? Because of the overlap. So essentially, their rule set is if anything overlaps, if any overlap exists, that's a cause for us to lay claim to something. They don't believe that they basically place themselves in the position as the dominant, as the master race. They must have came first and then spread their phenotype, even though they know the opposite is true, even though they literally are the ones who espouse the out of Africa theory and know they must have inherited their features from Africans. They will espouse they will promote the exact opposite. So this is what where the true Negro comes from. There's nothing scientific about it. It's just the case of it's outside of their range to be able to claim. And those are the little crumbs they'll give black people. Oh, this, they'll be looking at pre-dynastic Egypt and they'll go, oh yeah, well, it was only this Badari people, that were Negroes. All the rest from there are, mixed or this, that, and the other. It's not true at all. They're just showing different types of phenotypes that are not overtly outside of the range of Eurasians for them to be able to claim it as being a Caucasian trait. Let's move on. Sorry, went on a bit there. Now, one of the most portrayed individuals in ancient history. I said next. I think we've gone over that point. And then, are these portraits any good? I think we've talked about that as well. So, would you classify any of these portraits as good? And I think I'd classify them all as being excellent portraits. Even the idea of some of these ushabtis, which are, incredibly small. You've seen them in museums. They're tiny. And the fact that they could still manage to carve something and pull out the detail with their blunt tools that are no good at. They still managed to do that with these tiny ushabtis and make it look exactly like the life size or even larger imagery of King Tutankhamun. Let's move on. One of the first the second trait we've looked at kind of complexions and skin colors that have been shown on the statues. The next one that we're going to look at is actually this really amazing detail that is ignored by Egyptologists, and that is the deliberate reddening of the sclera that you find on all of Tutankhamun's portraits, and they actually intensify as he gets older. So starting from the head of Nefertiti, which I don't have here, but that's the one where he's really young. It's where his head's coming out of a flower. He has yellow eyes in that, and then they get deeper and deeper. The sentinel statues have particularly red eyes. This is a deliberate detail that has been added by the ancient Egyptian artists. I'm very grateful that they didn't notice it, because they would have painted over it if they did. So I'm glad they've kind of ignored them as much as possible, and we still have that detail preserved. Why is this significant? Because reddening or deepening or coloring of the sclera is actually a direct manifestation of deep melanation.
Oh, can I jump in there?
Absolutely.
Yeah, there's some big words that our audience needs to have explained. What on earth is the sclera?
So the sclera is the whites of your eyes.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a trait in Africans, very, very common in Africa. It's actually pretty much the status quo in Africa. People will have yellowed or reddened scleras. So they won't, it's rare to see the kind of clear white scleras like we do over here in the West. In Africa, it's just very common. And it's actually just a manifestation of how much melanin you have. Particularly when you're in warmer climates, it tends to start to express itself through the eyes. So what's really interesting is, you can see it on this outer cartilage. This is the most outer cartilage of the three golden masks of King Tutankhamun. You can see that deep red that's being shown there. On the actual very famous one, you can see there's quite a deep red being shown there. Both of the sentinel statues have a very deep reddening of the eyes. This is an amazing detail. I loved seeing it. It's a really amazing detail, and it's one that will go over the heads of many people, but it's not a trait that we share with Eurasians. We don't share this trait with Eurasians. It is very much an exclusively African trait. So why would they bother painting in this detail if it was not something that they were observing? This is clearly something that they were observing and something they wanted to detail. So the careful detailing of red linen acid of the sclera is a common trend in his art, which intensified in his older portraits. This is significant because it's a condition linked to buildup of melanin in continental African populations. And I just have a quote there from newhealthadvisor.org saying that most Africans have high levels of melanin that results in yellow eyes. Melanin determines the color of the skin, sclera, and eyes and hair. And when this concentration increases, the eye color becomes light yellow or muddy brown or reddens essentially. So this is what you'll see. So I'm sure you guys will note that or have noticed that when you're back home, either in Africa or the West Indies or Caribbean, you'll see the local people and they'll have these very strongly melanated scleras, and we now know what that manifestation looks like. And it's just the fact that King Tutankhamun showed that in his portrait. I just find an amazing detail. I've included this reconstruction. Actually, this one isn't my own. This is one that was done by a reconstruction artist called Dina Depina. She does amazing work, but I like this one because I like the way that she captured that detail really nice. And you can see it's a very good and quite a good definitive match to the portrait above that you can see.
All
So
right,
yeah,
so can I ask George or Danny, would you like to jump in at this point?
Yes. What I would say is that that is an amazing detail to catch. And I think it's really important. These kinds of like conversations are really important in terms of like informing people of, as you say, just how African, sort of like ancient Cometians, and in particular the royals, just how African the royals and the aristocrats are. It's so important, because it seems that the mainstream, their job and what they've done so successfully is to try and blindside people, try and ignore all of these really important details, make it really hard for people to argue the obvious, to argue the truth. So, yes, absolutely. All of these details are really important, and you're doing a fantastic job of articulating it. Thank you.
Thank you. And I really, the point that you raised there just resonates with me a lot. Once again, just stressing the Africanity on the, forget, sometimes we can get caught up in the blackness, but actually putting the blackness aside, okay, fine, they're black people. It's the actual Africanity that I find amazing. They're so similar to the African populations that surround Egypt. They're so similar to them. They're so similar to, there's so much cultural carryover, and even just like I said, this detail over here, it's a very African thing. I would say even to a lesser degree, when there's something about maybe the climate of being in the West that you don't see this melanation of the eyes so much when you maybe live in the UK. Maybe, I don't know, people who get eye drops or something like that to reduce it. Because maybe there's a stigma with it or something, or maybe it's something to do with the climate. But it's when you go back home, when you go to Africa and when you go to the Caribbean and you see the people that live in the tropical climates, you will see that intensity of the redness or the yellowness of the eyes. So yeah, just once again, just stressing the Africanity, I think is a really good point. I'll move on. So dolichocephaly, this is the discussion that we were having before. So this is to do with the skull shape of Tutankhamun. So I think a good place for us to start is just to look at Tutankhamun's skull. Now he has one of the most famous long skulls. In fact, I won't say one of the most famous. He has by a long shot the most famous long skull in history. he is known for having this incredibly long skull. Um, I say incredibly long skull, but I would say regionally normal skull. And this is, I mean, and that kind of goes part and parcel with how unfamiliar people are with African populations and how much we've been disregarded in the discussion of ancient Egypt. Because if people were aware of African phenotypic traits surrounding Egypt, so it's not even like we're not even talking about going 1,000 miles away. We're talking funny, just take a little hop, skip, and a jump down to Aswan. Okay. Sudan, Ethiopia, Uganda, Rwanda. You know, you could skip across to any of these areas and you'll see King Tutankhamun's head on every single youth you encounter. That's how common it is. And yet, for years, we've had this speculation about him being some kind of an alien being, about head deformation, that even some of our own people we've fallen for, oh, yeah, was his head deformed? It's like, no, he's just literally got an African long head. That's what he has. There's nothing extreme about Tutankhamun's head in the context of surrounding African populations. And that's provable. We'll go through a little bit of data, but that's provable. It's a very normal head. However, if you take Tutankhamun's head outside of Africa and you place it in the Middle East, in North Africa, in Europe, suddenly it becomes this controversial thing that needs explaining. And what that is dolichocephaly, which is essentially when the skull is longer or significantly longer than it is wide. So it's calculated by ratios. So if you have a 75% ratio, i.e., 100 long, 75 wide or less, then you have a dolichocephalic skull. Then mesocephalic is kind of like I'll go to brachycephalic. Brachycephalic is when you kind of have almost even, so above 80%, where it's kind of like its length versus its width is almost even and wider than that. So that's kind of your round or wide skull. And then you have mesocephalic, which sits in the middle, or mesocephalic, called both, which sits in the middle, which is basically between 75 and 80. Now, when it comes to the ancient Egyptian skulls, they are overwhelmingly, disproportionately dolichocephalic. It's literally widespread and rife. There was a study done by Raymond Dart, which I haven't put it into the presentation, but we can discuss how we can share that later. But he tested 2,861 skulls from all dynasties. So from the pre-dynastic right up to the New Kingdom, he tested multiple skulls, and the skulls were essentially overwhelmingly dolichocephalic. So we're talking about 60 to 70, in some dynasties, 80% dolichocephalic, a large proportion mesocephalic, and then a very tiny minority. And we're talking about, in the pre-dynastic, a couple of skulls that were brachycephalic. In the intermediary periods, interestingly enough, brachycephaly would shoot up. So in the 9th dynasty, brachycephaly shoots up to 11%, still a minority, of very small in comparison to modern European populations. But then after the first intermediary period into the Middle Kingdom, brachycephaly shoots back down to under 2%, and you have a majority dolichocephalic skulls. Now, why is that significant? Well, first of all, just to have a quick visual glance, will we all agree that that's a very normal looking African head here? Very normal looking, yeah. This is a typical dolichocephalic skull. Now, this looks normal to us, yeah. These skull shapes will look normal to us. I've got several, friends, nieces, I'll say nephews, nieces who have heads like this. This is very normal to us, but what we may not be aware of is that take this skull shape and place it in another ethnicity and it will become very odd to look at. It's not something that's carried across in large proportions to Eurasians and Asians. In fact, it's very rare in Europe for people to have this length of skull. So this is probably why when we look at King Tutankhamun's skull, to maybe us as Africans, it's just like, oh, he's got a bit of a bean. It's nothing drastic. It's whereas to someone who maybe doesn't have that kind of access to dolichocephaly, it's what is that? Is that an alien? What's going on over here? So I've given a bit of an image dump of various African ethnicities so we can kind of see what the dolichocephalic skull looks like. And then in comparison, your typical Eurasian skull, which will sit between brachycephalic and mesocephalic, but not brachycephaly essentially is the dominant head shape in Europe. So this is typically what you get, a very flat back of head. They won't get that kind of rear protrusion that you'll find on African skulls. That's very normal. I don't even have a dolichocephalic skull. My skull is mesocephalic, but I still have that rear protrusion. It's a very African thing. Eurasians tend to have a much more flat back of skull. So they tend to sit in the brachycephalic range with some mesocephalic, but even when you get your occasional dolichocephalic European, they tend to not have that rear protrusion. It will kind of express itself slightly different than it does in Africans. So why is this significant? Because, like I've explained, ancient Egyptians were overwhelmingly dolichocephalic. So remember, when we're talking about head shapes here, we're not talking about extremes, i.e., we're not saying this is a dolichocephalic, this person's dolichocephalic, they must be black and must be African. This person's brachycephalic, they must be white and must be Eurasian. That's incorrect. You get entire ethnicities in Africa that are brachycephalic. The point is that dolichocephaly at these kind of rates, the rates found in ancient Egypt, are only found in African populations. You will only get a 60% dolichocephalic rate in an African population. That doesn't exist anywhere else. You might get the odd dolichocephalic person popping up in Europe and Asia, but you will not get a population when 70% of the people, 60% of the people, even 20% of the people are dolichocephalic. You just won't get that in Eurasia. You only get that in Africa. So once again, it's the culmination of the data in its entirety, taken its entirety, that gives us the impression that these people must have been African. And I gave you the kind of the broad sweeping look at the entire look of the from pre-dynastic up into New Kingdom. But actually, if you focus in on the pharaonic lineages, the pharaohs were all dolichocephalic. Every single last one of them. When it comes to the nobility and the pharaohs, all of them. And this is including Ramesses, the red-haired Ramesses they like so much, incredibly dolichocephalic. Yuya, I think his cephalic index was 70. Obviously, King Tutankhamun, who's dolichocephalic, and we're going to come on to the fact that Zahi Hawass, that little trickster, has published on several occasions that King Tutankhamun is brachycephalic. So I want you to look at that image, yeah, and then tell me, how has Zahi Hawass come up with the calculation that this person is brachycephalic? I'll show you how he's done it, by the way, but I want that to be a little bit of a jaw-dropping moment. Like, what kind of deception? How everyone on earth knows that King Tutankhamun has a long skull. If you was to go to any child and say, tell me one thing about King Tutankhamun's head, they'd say it's very long. That's what everyone would say. And yet Zahi Hawass is so cynical and so deriding of African people that he thinks he can publish something that is a complete lie and not get challenged. And in many ways, he's right, because no one did challenge him when he published this in his book, Scanning the Pharaohs, which I use as a resource, and also in his 2010 study on ancestry and pathology of the New Kingdom Pharaohs. He posted in both of those that King Tutankhamun was brachycephalic. That's a wild lie. And there's a reason he's doing that, which we're going to come on to. So you have your African populations, which Africa is overwhelmingly dolichocephalic, but you have the other head shapes there. You have whole entire ethnicities, particularly I think in Ghana, where you'll find people who have brachycephalic head shapes. So this is not exclusive at all. once again, we're just talking about rates. Yoruba tend to be incredibly dolichocephalic. I think they have an average index of 72, which is more dolichocephalic than like the Maasai and the Nandi, who are around 73, 74. But overwhelmingly, dolichocephaly is a African trait. Then you have Eurasians, who have somewhere between mesocephalic and brachycephalic. So they'll sit kind of between that range, most of them being brachycephalic, but a good proportion being mesocephalic, kind of that moderate range. And then Asians, i.e. East Asians, tend to have very brachycephalic skulls, incredibly. In fact, it's almost an impossibility that you'll come across a Asian who has a dolichocephalic skull. So, your Far Easterners, Chinese, Koreans, things, it's almost unheard of. You'll never see that. They all sit in that brachycephalic range pretty much. So skull shapes also have very high heritability. So this is why it's something that can be used. I would never use it in isolation, just to be clear. I would never say one skull is this, therefore this person is that. I don't think that's how it should be used. It's more a case of, once again, just looking at the entirety of the population and saying, where do we see these kind of numbers? That's, I think, the safest way to use it. So any questions that before I move on from that slide?
Yes, just a very quick one. Just sky blue thinking here. Obviously, dolichocephalic. If I if you forgive the mispronunciation there.
I've lost you.
I think you were breaking up there. I don't know. We might be losing you there.
Okay. Start. I think it's back now. Sorry about that. I did
Right.
lose you.
Yes.
So I didn't get any of that. I'm sorry. Could you repeat the
Yeah.
question?
Just your point about dolichocephaly. If I
Yeah.
pronounce that correctly. Just sky blue thinking here. It's a profoundly African trait. It's found in very low frequencies elsewhere. And I'm just wondering, in terms of like anchoring it in for like common people, or people who aren't as well versed in this sort of material, is there anything else associated with that which makes it profoundly African in terms of like environment? Is it shaped by environment, and can we link it to environment?
Okay. So that's a very good question, and very. See, I've got my theory about it, and it would only be a theory. It's the long and short story is we've got two concerns here. First of all, when it comes to any field of anthropometrics, which I do touch on my channel quite a lot, it obviously brings up a lot of concerns around phrenology, which obviously historically was an issue, i.e., the idea that someone expresses certain physical traits and therefore we're saying they're this and they're that. Which I find very interesting, because they still do that about race and they don't care. But when we do it about skull shapes, all of a sudden it's like Hitler, but it's the same thing. To me, they kind of go hand in hand. Why do Africans have more dolichocephalic skulls than Eurasians? To be honest with you, my answer would be that I think that Eurasians descended from a brachycephalic minority. I think all of the skull shapes have been indigenous to for some time, but I think Eurasians descend from a brachycephalic out of Africa movement. That's where a lot of their ancestry comes from. The reason I'd argue that is because there's a heritability factor when it comes to these skull shapes. They are actually more heritable than your bodily anthropometrics. So it would make sense. And also, if you look in Africa, for instance, and once again, I could go to West Africa and I could talk about neighboring communities that have been neighboring for a very long time, can have completely divergent skull shapes. So you can have a very dolichocephalic population sitting next to, I think the Yoruba are dolichocephalic, 72, and then the Irobo are brachycephalic. and these people have been neighboring for at least quite a bit of time, from what I can see historically. So they've got these divergent head shapes. So I can't read too much into what the client, whether it's a climactic adaptation historically, but I think in terms of the reason Eurasians and Asians are that way is because they descend from groups that were perhaps of the brachycephalic nature that moved into those parts of the world. And I couldn't and wouldn't read beyond that. Zahi Hawass controversy, because I raised this and I think this is an important point. So I spoke to you guys earlier about the fact that Zahi Hawass, who just to introduce the people who don't know who this is the former Minister for Egyptian Antiquities. He was so for a very long time. Robin, how long was this pain in the backside running Egypt? You'll know better than me.
Yeah, basically, that was his gig for years and years and years.
Too long, I think we'd both agree. And the amount of, I mean, I laugh, but the amount of destruction that was done at this guy's hands is shocking. But the reason I raise him on this point is, first of all, because obviously when he published the fact that King Tutankhamun was brachycephalic, not only was that very troubling to me, considering I thought it was just common knowledge that everyone knew that this person was dolichocephalic and had a very long head. It's the brazenness of it. And then obviously the acknowledgement for him knowing the significance of the ancient Egyptians being almost uniformly dolichocephalic. He obviously had an issue with this because it goes against his whole idea that the ancient Egyptians were black, but not the N word, which is one of his famous quotes that he made. So when I purchased his book, like I said, Scanning the Pharaohs, it was like, so that's what it is. That's how he gets there, because he doesn't give any indication in his paper about ancestry and pathology about how he got to the calculation. He just states it. King Tutankhamun and Akhenaten, or KV55, we don't know if that's Akhenaten or not, but King Tutankhamun and KV55, both of them are brachycephalic, and then he just moves on and he gives their reading, which is wild as well. Not even like slightly. I mean, he's got Tutankhamun at 84%, which is like super brachycephalic. That's like you've got no back of head if you're 84%. Mm-hmm. So this was wild and bizarre to me. But then I saw his book and I noticed a trend. And the trend was every time I saw King Tutankhamun's skull, it was oriented in this strange fashion. And I kept thinking, are they doing that to fit it in the box? I thought it was the way they were taking the photo. And then it dawned on me, no, he's not doing that to take the photo. He's suggesting that this angle is Tutankhamun looking straight ahead. So he's basically suggesting Tutankhamun, rather than being prognathic, is extremely retrographic. His jaw points upwards for some weird reason rather than flat like most people. And his back obviously had this massive arch in it. Obviously, he's being completely ridiculous because this is King Tutankhamun's skull oriented correctly, facing straight forward, looking completely normal. The top of his head is flat, and this is the length of his skull from the front to the back. But if he orients his head, in this way, he's now suggesting, well, this is the back of Tutankhamun's head, and this is the front. And so now I can do my measurement from here to here, which is the top of his forehead, to the back of his neck, and say, well, that's my length. And I'll multiply that by my width. And that's where I'm going to get my cephalic index. And that's exactly what he did. So he basically, by tilting his skull, gave himself different measurements to then declare that a dolichocephalic skull is actually brachycephalic.
Wow.
And that's the kind of lengths that people like him will go to. And obviously, I just put this image in as a bit of a bonus. You can clearly see what his head looks like when that hat is off. You know, he's obviously a very brachycephalic person. Yeah. And he wants Tutankhamun's head to be like his. Not ultimately, because he's pushing the whole idea that the ancient Egyptians are his ancestors, and therefore they can't have these African head shapes. But how much self-denial do you have to be in to tilt Tutankhamun's head like that and say this is the way it's oriented correctly? You know, there's a really worrying pathology going on there. To me, it's disturbing. I'm going to be totally honest with you. Sorry, can you hear my doorbell?
No, no, you're fine. You're fine.
Okay, good, good. Sorry, my
No,
doorbell's actually.
basically, I'm shocked and awed by what you've just said here.
Mm. It's and these are the kind of tricks they play. So I think the good thing is when we make these kind of revelations about how they do this, you realize that all gloves are off when it comes to these guys. They're really not operating out of a realm of integrity here. If you see the amount of, Tutankhamun's tomb was exhumed for all intents and purposes in the modern era. It wasn't like one of these, it was 1922. The camera was invented, the video camera, everything was there. And they've still managed to sabotage, I would say, 70% of his Ushabtis by just basically shaving them, that cleaning them. So this is all happening in a time when Egypt was, Egypt had control of its antiquities to a degree. I know they were colonized, but by that era, they had more control of their antiquities than they did, in the late 1800s, in the 19th century. They had far more control. All of this stuff is going on, and Zahi Hawass kind of brought that into the 20th century. He continues to, or at least continued to, malform, deface, destroy, and lie about who these Egyptians were. Like, how can you take someone who everyone knows globally has a long head and just declare his head is not long, your eyes don't work, his head is square, and not be challenged? That's the most worrying thing, is that there's no one in Egyptology or anthropology. Anthropologists should have challenged him. Someone should have said, Zai, what is going on here? How can you say this guy's, this your measurements are incorrect? No one's done it. And that's why he does it, because he get away with it scot-free. Now, I've heard that Zahi Hawass, as you know, is very belligerent and he'll have you blocked and barred if you challenge him. But I still don't think that's an excuse. I still think if the academic world want to be taken seriously, they have to do more in these situations. That is unacceptable that he got away with this. I want to move on to this. So this will be my final slide, which is overjet, overbite, prognathism, and diastema, which we kind of touched on a bit earlier. So this is talking about the traits that you see in Tutankhamun's skull. So this is Tutankhamun's skull after Howard Carter had beheaded it, after cutting off all of his limbs and showing the total disregard and disdain that they would only show a black monarch, but still claim he's white afterwards. But the thing about Tutankhamun's skull is, I mean, how can anyone look at that image and say it's not an African? First of all, that's just bizarre. But anyway, the thing about Tutankhamun's skull is has these very distinctive African traits. And one of them that Africans have, particularly in that region, so this actually, I would say, is a regionally East African trait, is the overjet and overbite. So overjet,
I think you need to explain what overjet is.
I will. So overjet is essentially the slanting of the teeth, as opposed, so if rather than the teeth coming down like that vertically, they come down at kind of that angle. Okay. So they lean forward and lean. It's a very African trait. Most African people have it. Most, even if you don't notice you've ever had it, now that I've said it, you'll probably go in the mirror and you'll realize that your top teeth slightly lean forward. It's just kind of, it's a very, very universal black trait, although not exclusively universal. Some don't have it. But obviously, and it's very common in ancient Egypt, as you can imagine as well. So overjet is when they kind of slant forward. Overbite is when your top teeth or your maxilla is over your bottom teeth or your mandible. So when you have that, when it goes slightly over, so that's your overbite, is you're biting over, you're going down more than you that rather than stopping dead center. So that's overbite. And then diastema is just the gapping of the teeth. Sometimes it's restricted to the front teeth, but sometimes it's slightly more than that. Now, these traits, three traits in concert, is a very, very East African thing. I'm sure even as I'm saying it, you're thinking about some friends you've got. It's very, very common amongst Afar, Somali, Tutsi, Kenyans. I've got a few images here just to kind of like ring a bell, and you'll see it's very, don't get me wrong, you have it in other areas, but I'd say it's less common in other parts of Africa, but along the Nile in particular. So right from the Great Lakes, right up to the, right up to Egypt, all of the populations that border the Nile, they seem to have these traits, these teeth. And Tutankhamun was one of them. He had all of these three traits. So he had overbite, he had overjet, and he had diastema. And as you know, there's been a lot of over explaining about King Tutankhamun's teeth to try and make the claim that it's a result of inbreeding. And then they make these reconstructions where his teeth are protruding between his lips. Sorry, but that's not what we see on his statues, and that's not an African thing. Africans have fuller lips. So even when we are exhibiting all of these traits, we can show a perfectly aesthetic closed mouth, which doesn't look terrible at all. These are very natural African traits. These are part of what makes Africans in that region very distinctive. On a visual basis, you'll kind of see them and you'll know that's kind of a very much East African trait. And so what you're seeing in King Tutankhamun is a very, very normal Nilotic African skull. Literally, it's just so normal. So from his dolichocephaly to the expression of overjet, overbite, the mild prognathism that he shows, the diastema that he shows, this is just a very typical. You could take King Tutankhamun's skull, you could place it in Somalia, Ethiopia, Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, Nubia, any of those regions, and it would look totally normal. You could take tissue data from any of those regions and produce a totally feasible human being. But what you find is, on that note of tissue data, and this is probably important to touch on. So this goes way back. When it comes to Africans, there are many Africans that are not given a voice. And when I say I'm not given a voice, it means they're not represented on the media. They're not represented in anthropological studies. They're not represented across the board. They're totally ignored. And there's a reason for this. The reason for this is because these types of Africans are very detrimental to the Eurocentric dialogue, to the Eurocentric norms that they've put out there. When it comes to Africa, they're only interested, like we are having the conversation, myself and Georgia having a conversation earlier. When it comes to African populations, they're only interested in the ones that can give them the true Negro, i.e. that extreme. They don't want the Africans that have the features that have overlap with, the Caucasian races or white people that have that overlap. They don't want those people to have any representation. They won't give them any representation. They'll pretend they don't exist because then they can continue to claim things that don't belong to them. If people were aware of East African phenotypes and all of the different ways that expresses itself across the Nile, down the Nile, even across the Sahel to a large degree, these different regions, then we wouldn't even be having this argument about were the ancient Egyptians black or not. But it's only in the ignorance of people not knowing that these different phenotypes exist that they get away with this, because they can claim things and they can claim a skull. Oh, we've got this skull. It's clearly a mixed skull. We found it in in Africa over here, blah, 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 blah. But it's not a true Negro, so it's mixed. It's like, what are you talking about? It looks exactly like the people of Nigeria. Are you crazy? But this is what they, this is how they get away with it. In fact, I can just really quickly, I wanted to just, I'm not going to go through this, but I just wanted to mention a study really quickly because this is, and this will typify exactly what I'm saying. Sorry, I'll just find it very, very quickly. It's come to mind and I think it's very pertinent for the discussion that I just mentioned this quickly. I'll mention that one and sorry, this one. So this is it. So this study by Leslie Farkas, and Farkas actually is quite a leading name in anthropology. It's called the International Anthropometric Study of Facial Morphology in Various Ethnic Groups. So in the realm of anthropology, they'll tend to fall on a lot of the same data. They build up quite a joint database or a joint data set when it comes to different populations. And the reason I say that is because this study covers several populations. I think it covers in the region of about 40 populations in Europe. But when it comes to Black populations, okay, do you know how many they have? Just to be clear, I'll tell you. They have 4.
Wow.
So the entirety of Black people is summarized in 4 populations, and those are Angolan, Tonga, Zulu, and African American.
Wow.
And that's it. So if you're, and notice the ethnicities there as well, what I said about true Negro stereotypes, yeah? Zulu, Tonga, African American. There's no effort here to have any representation of Sahelian types, no Niger, no Chad, no Cushitic types, no Hausa, no Fula, no, no Rwanda, no Uganda, no Kenyan. All those people do not exist when it comes to anthropology. And with them not existing and with them not being sampled, they can continue to make these wild claims because all they can compare a skull to is, well, give us the African American data. Oh, well, they don't sorry, they don't match. It's more like us than an African American, so therefore this skull must be hybridized with a European. They can fall on that plausible deniability. So it's very, very deliberate that certain ethnicities do not get representation. It's when you start to invite the fullness of African phenotypic diversity that all of their house of cards starts to fall over. And you realize these people have just been lying to everyone about who these people are in the hope that you would never come across these different forms of Africans. So yeah, that's I think that's it for the last slide and the presentation.
All right, thank you very much. Any questions or comments from Danny and George, please?
Well,
Yeah,
that was
just like to say,
Hey, Danny.
what a fantastic presentation. Thank you. And I think one of the most important things that you've revealed to us in absolute detail is just the degree to which the Eurocentrists will lie 6 inches from your face in order to preserve their illusion. And I think it's important for scholars such as yourself to be revealing these lies. So and also your own reconstruction work and everything. So all I can say is thank you. It's amazing work, and it's quite an honor to be here sharing it with you. So thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Yeah. Again, just echoing what Danny has said. It's a really powerful lecture, and it exposes a lot. And you do that in a very fluid and easy to understand way. I mean, just looking at this, I have so many questions, but we can leave that to another time. Look at these monstrosities on the right. I'm sorry, what's going on? I mean, the cognitive dissonance here. The one which is kind of brownish at the top there. Okay, and so the sort of like it's a narrative, right? The narrative is, well, they're inbred, and this has been going on for generations. They're deformed. Maybe that's why they look a little bit like black people, right? But look at what they've done. Again, what you've explained about the prognatism, the diastema, if I got that correctly. What are they doing with his teeth? Why are they broken? And why aren't they broken on his corpse? His corpse has perfect teeth, but yet they'll represent that as if he's got some kind of like deformity, with his mouth. I haven't seen that too often, so I don't think that they've kept that around too long. The one at the bottom, what is going on? The white one.
Yeah, that's Chris Corbett's one.
Sorry, man, what the hell's going on? And actually, I think I've seen a version of this where the eyes are open. And I've talked to Robin, and I'm not sure if I mentioned this to Danny, but looking at that one, right? I have so many problems with that. That is not a young 18-year-old, young boy of any description. That's what, a 30-year-old man. What is going on with the way how they built up the jaw? And
it looks like handsome Squidward people. Don't know if you've seen that one. Sorry, go on.
But King's Monologue, just to ask you, with some of these ones, obviously they're trying to paint them as Semitic or people from the Levant and so forth.
Yeah.
But if you look at it and you actually paint that chocolate colored, you get a West African as well. You get someone who has West African traits. As far as they're trying to get away with it, they create something which is either monstrous or something which is contrived. But if you really look at it, it's still, in truth, really a African variant.
Yeah.
Not in East Africa. It doesn't look anything like Tutankhamun.
Yeah.
At all. It doesn't look like a young boy. It looks more like a middle-aged man who, if you paint black, can be described as a kind of West African.
Yeah, agree.
Thank you very much.
Sorry. No, I was going to say I agree, and I think it just goes back to the point that we talked about earlier, is that the outcomes are always the same. It's always going to look, like you said, if they're honest, it's going to look like an African. And if not, it's just going to look like a human that doesn't exist. It's going to look like this new kind of hybridized being, because they're essentially creating something that doesn't exist. You're trying to plaster these features onto an African body and hope that you come out with something that looks remotely human. If you just really quickly, just drop forward to, I mean, when have you seen a human that looks like this? This is the side view of Elizabeth Dana's Reconstruction. I mean, this person does not exist in any population. That's just the be all and end all of it. You couldn't say, oh, well, that kind of looks like doesn't look like anything. I've never seen a Eurasian with a head that sticks out like that at the back, and it just doesn't go with anything. So yeah, I agree wholeheartedly.
Right. Can I jump in there? Can you go back to the previous slide, sir?
Yes.
One of the things that the Black community needs to do is, I think we need to spread a campaign, and you'd be very useful to that, to call out the Reconstruction, especially the one that is top right. I call it the Putin Reconstruction.
Yeah.
And if we all stay on code and call that the Putin Reconstruction, eventually they will have to withdraw it. The other point that I wanted to make is, obviously, we are very grateful for your time in being here. And I think you should tell the audience how they can support you and what you do and point people towards your pages and so forth.
Thank you. Okay, so the first thing you could do obviously is find me on TikTok or YouTube or Instagram, and please do like just hit follow. I think it's the King's Monologue. If you search that on, I think all of those platforms, you should find me. It should come up top in on all of those platforms. And then if you want to support my research, because I do have a Patreon, and I do obviously do all of this independently without pay. So yeah, obviously if I can get support from the community, it just gives me a bit more time to do things like research content and write papers. So I have a Patreon, and I think the handle on the Patreon is the King's Monologue as well. In fact, let me just double check. I think it is. I'll confirm that. Oh, no, it doesn't have a handle. I'd probably have to give you the link. I didn't realize I don't actually have a handle for that. If you search me on Patreon, you'll probably find it under the King's Monologue, but I don't actually have the link is just kind of like an alphanumeric at the moment.
Well, what you can do as well is to email us the links,
Sure.
and we can find ways of publishing it on the page.
Thank you. Yeah, that would be great. So yeah, that was very handy, particularly a couple of months ago when I was writing my response. Actually, it's interesting. The point that you made earlier, Robin, regarding us challenging, I think is very important. So the person who did this reconstruction is a reconstruction artist called Cesare Moraes. I've mentioned him already. He's one of the leading reconstruction artists out there at the moment. And me and him are have had a very public back and forth. And I know that he's constantly on my YouTube page. And constantly asking me now, I'll make a reconstruction. He'll be like, "Is this about me, Andrew?" And no, this isn't about you. Go away. So he watches and he responds. He's made reconstructions, I know, that have been a direct response to the work that we're doing. So I know him, and he's obviously well tapped into the Egyptological community. I know he very much responds to the work that we do. In fact, this reconstruction you see here, out of all the reconstructions, so this is his one over here, you notice that this is the only one that has a nose that's remotely close to Tutankhamun's real nose. Yeah, and that was a response to critique that we put out. He made this after my reconstruction of Tutankhamun was going viral. He made this, and I did a video instantly, and I said, "This is a response," because obviously the reconstruction I was doing was getting much more. It was viewed as much more credible because I'd honored the artist. So he's done a reconstruction, and out of nowhere he's incorporated a nose that he's never used before, by the way, because his reconstructions are very easy to spot. He's never done a nose like that, and he tried to say, "Oh, well, this is the nose that the skull gave me." It's like, rubbish. You've blatantly looked at the statue and tried to, bring it in to kind of give some credibility to Egyptologists who are losing. I would say the good news is people are definitely, the argument feels like it's shifted from were the ancient Egyptians black more to, okay, they were black, but they weren't African like you. They weren't your kind of black. That's where it's kind of shifted to, which to me is progress. I feel like you can say it doesn't bother me when people be like, "Oh, well, they weren't Nigerian." I'm like, I never said they were. And the bottom line is they were black. Yeah. And so you kind of see that argument shifting even amongst those really, really R-word people. So it's that at least there's been some progression there, I feel.
And thank you very much. I mean, basically, I feel thoroughly schooled today. So if I can speak for the rest of the Black Secret, we are truly honored to have had you on our program.
Thank you.
And thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Welcome to the Black Secret.